who knows it's time to sit. I follow his lead. The Lord be with you. All right. So here we are at the beginning of a sermon series on a short 4-chapter book tucked away in the Hebrew Bible. And as we start this series, let me thank all of you who sent all of the jokes and humor about Ruth and Boaz this past week. But outside of getting some of those references, Ruth is not really a book we spend much time on as Lutherans. While many of our Jewish siblings actually read it yearly during some of their high holy days, I'm not actually sure I've ever heard a sermon preached on Ruth. And I'm actually pretty sure I wasn't all that familiar with it until I had to read it, or it was assigned and I in theory read it for my intro to Bible class in college. But that may be due largely to the fact that the VeggieTales version of this story did not come out until 2015. So I was already, in college, past college. So given that I can safely assume that most of you are like me and haven't heard a lot of sermons on the book of Ruth, there is a lot to cover in 4 short chapters, right? There's a lot of places we could start. One of the most obvious places we could start is with the title of the sermon series. Oops, I turned my mic off.
There we go. Is the title of this sermon series, The Gospel According to Ruth. How many of y'all caught that? The Gospel According to Ruth. How many of you did it raise questions for? Because gospel is not usually something we ascribe to the books of the Old Testament. Right? Usually when we're talking about gospels, we are talking about the story of Jesus contained in the first 4 books of the New Testament. So for your regularly scheduled PA Greek lesson, gospel comes from the word euangelion, which is just a fun word to say, right? And it means good news. During the life of Jesus, this would have meant any generic good news. But when we talk about the Gospels, we are talking about the good news of Jesus Christ. When all of that is capitalized, good news of Jesus. But when we are talking about the Gospels, with lowercase, we are talking about good news in general. And in faith settings, what that means is we are talking about general good news and the good news of God contained in the Bible. So the Gospel of Ruth, well, not one of the Gospels, does tell us the good news of God. And as we start looking at the gospel contained in Ruth, I could do a whole sermon this morning, basically resembling a seminary lecture, those sermons that you heard Nathan talk about that were whole exegetical explorations of texts. We could offer one of them. There are whole seminary classes offered on 4 chapters of the book of Ruth. People write their doctorates on this book. We could talk about the why and the how of the story of Ruth. We could talk about how scholars agree that it is most likely a work of historical fiction. Many even argue that it was first told by wise women because it centers women in the story, unlike many of our biblical texts. But what that means is that even though this is a work of historical fiction, it doesn't make it any less true, because while it may not be true, aka scientifically provable, it is the truth in that it tells God's truth. It tells the truthiest truth about God's action in the world. I was trying to come up with a comparison for this and what this looks like, and I've decided that the musical Hamilton is the best way I have to talk about this, because Hamilton is not really true. They weren't all singing all the time, and all of the characters did not exist, but it tells the truth of a story. And this is what we have with Ruth. Right? We could spend hours talking about the names given to us in those first 5 verses, which let's give a hand to Bob for muddling his way through some of those, because Hebrew names transliterated into English. Right? We open talking about a man named Elimelech, whose name means God is king. Which is a reminder that we are in the days of Judges, where the people had begged God for a human leader and king, and when they got it, let's just say it didn't go according to human plan. Or then we have his wife Naomi, whose name means pleasing and agreeable, which will get more interesting in just a few verses when she changes her name to Mara, meaning bitter. Or we have their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, whose names respectively mean weakly and sick or pining and suffering, which I don't know if that's some serious foreshadowing or just self-fulfilling prophecy. Orpah, who marries one of these sons, names refers to the back of one's neck, which is what we see when she turns and walks away from Naomi and Ruth in just a few chapters. Or the namesake of the whole book, Ruth, whose name is loyal, compassionate friend. And finally, my favorite, Bethlehem, which is a name we all know well, but did you know that it's Bethlehem, meaning house of bread in Hebrew? And fun things I learned during my time in Palestine, in Arabic, it's house of meat. So however you translate it, it's house of food, and that city is experiencing a severe famine at the opening of our story. And maybe this just seems like a fun rabbit hole to go down, but it actually is really important because names in the Bible mean something. And all of these names in this setting help us set the stage for the book that we are going to spend the next several weeks studying, as we study a book focused on the story of a foreign woman who showed great loyalty and devotion, who lived into her name of compassionate and loyal friend, and she would become a part of our faith legacy, the great grandmother of King David, and one of 5 women named in all of Jesus' lineage. But as we might expect with a story like this, her story doesn't start in happiness and sunshine and rainbows, does it? It starts with the world falling apart. The opening line of our text today is, "In the days when the judges ruled Israel, a severe famine came upon the land." The time of the judges was a time in the history of the Israelites when there was marked by disobedience to God, where there was military and oppressive leadership and just general chaos and exile. Add to that the city literally named House of Bread is experiencing a severe famine, and this is not a great start for a story, is it? So we have our little family that leaves in search of food, and it's so bad that they leave their homeland to go to that of their enemies. Because Israelites and Moabites weren't exactly great allies, so it had to be not stellar for them to leave. And it goes from bad to worse when shortly after they arrive, their provider, the husband, dies, leaving a single mom in a foreign land with 2 kids named Sickly and Suffering. Eventually, those 2 sons take wives, and then not long after, they also die, which again, self-fulfilling prophecy when you name your kids Sickly and Suffering. So Naomi is left on her own, husbandless and sonless, with 2 foreign-born daughters-in-law trying to figure out how 3 women are going to provide for themselves in a world where that was harder than hard. And this is where our story starts, with everything falling apart. But it's not where our story ends. Because while our reading today may end there, the story continues. Somewhere along the way, I picked up a phrase from somebody, I have no idea where from. It will all be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. Or in the words of Gracie Allen, which have been more recently popularized by the United Church of Christ, never place a period where God has placed a comma. God's story never ends with the falling apart. In fact, I would argue it's usually how God's story begins. I mean, the whole of God's narrative in the Bible starts in chaos. The whole of God's story starts with God's breath moving over chaos. Because without spoiling all of the sermons yet to come on Ruth, the story of Ruth tells us the truth with a capital T, the truthiest truth, that God's story is always one of redemption and restoration. Right? God's story is always moving towards life. Now, as I feel like I say a lot, like every time we talk about things falling apart in church, this all comes with a huge caveat that God does not cause things to fall apart so God can redeem them. But God is active and moving even when things are falling apart. Ruth is a story of God working in and through the lives of the outcast, the marginalized, and the foreigner. It is a story of God working in and through the ordinary moments of our life. It is a story of God bringing life and redemption to a world that feels like it is all falling apart. Ruth's story reminds us that even when it feels like it's falling apart, even when it feels like a mess, even when it feels like more than we can handle, God is still present, God is still working, God is still moving. Ruth, the woman whose story starts with everything going from bad to worse, ends her story as one of the matriarchs in the lineage of Jesus, God's own Son. Sometimes it takes a while for us to see the whole picture. You can't quite read it on this because it's so small, but in between David and Jesse, it says 28 generations. It took a while for Ruth's story to come to the fullness of fruition, but God is always moving us towards redemption and restoration. So, dear ones, this week when it feels like the world is falling apart, or when you feel stuck in the menial sludge of everyday life and wonder what it's all for, or when you're really just not sure, may you rest in the promise that is the promise not just in the story of Ruth or in the life and love of Jesus, but in the story of each and every one of our ancestors in faith, that God is working in and through the ordinary and the chaos for the purpose of good and beauty and grace and life. And all of God's people say, I invite you to stand and join us in singing.